Welcome to the Todd DeVoe Show, exploring the best ideas and lessons for leaders.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are at in this fine world. And, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so if my voice sounds funny or whatever, if I cough or sneeze, I do pre-apologize for that. But we're going to get through this because this is an important conversation. And I have Josh Bowen with me, coming from the Great White North and Canada here, and we're going to talk about leading resilience and robust communities, and also, some of the issues that we're having in across the board in higher education, emergency management. Josh, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Todd. Great to be here.
Awesome. Man, we were talking earlier about the books, and just wanted to let everybody know that these are actual real backgrounds. They're not virtual backgrounds on both of us. So. Here I go. Okay, every time I laugh, I cough. Okay, all right, no more laughing because I start coughing, and that's it. So, Josh, tell me some of the work you're doing, because this kind of really, when I noticed you first on LinkedIn, was a couple of the pieces that you put out regarding resiliency and community robustness. And one of the things I've noticed over the last few years is like the term resiliency has kind of got squishy, and and so when Nicholas Taleb was looking for a harder word than resiliency when he was writing his book. He wrote Antifragile, and so he coined that word. What is resiliency and community robustness to you?
Yeah, I mean that's a great stepping off point. I love Taleb's construct of antifragile, right? Because that's really what it comes down to. I mean, resiliency means the ability to bounce back and blah blah blah, and that's great. But if all we're doing is bouncing back, that means that we're still going to build houses in floodplains, that we're not going to fire smart communities, that we're still going to be like, hey, this fault line looks like a great place to put a bridge. Let's do that. And so when we actually look at how we build resilient communities, we need to look and say, what's the physical geography that we're talking about? What is the natural world that we're talking about here? What are the hazards that are present there? Then we look at the built world, and like we built a lot of stuff over the years, right? And so what does that do? What hazards does that bring, and what are we exposing people to in terms of those that natural or the built world? And then let's layer in the social world, right? Because if a tree falls in the forest, does anybody care? Right. If it hits a person, yes, we do, right? And then it's an emergency, right? Or we got to deal with that. And if it knocks out, a pipeline and we've got an oil spill, now it's a disaster. But if it doesn't impact people, then that's kind of a different issue, right? And so we have to layer in that social world and understand what makes communities vulnerable and what puts people at risk or exposed to hazards. And then we've got this whole cyber world that we can talk about too. But really, understanding those four different layers and then how they actually interact. So go all the way up and all the way back down, and go from there. And how do we make that anti-fragile?
So when we look at this, and you're right, and I've been talking to my students about this for a little bit regarding the idea of is it a disaster or crisis if it doesn't impact humans? And there's the strong argument that says no, it's just a natural occurrence that's occurring, right? So if we had a wildland fire, which are needed, by the way, for those that don't understand the science of things, you need to have these fires come through, as unfortunate as they seem to us, but it also helps germinate seeds, and it burns up the stuff on the bottom of the ground that's been laying there for years, and it really rejuvenates the forest, right? So that's kind of taking care of itself. Now, when it impacts humans, that's when it becomes a big disaster, right? So, do you subscribe? I got two questions, but one is, do you subscribe to that? Like, there are no natural disasters. There's only natural hazards that turn into disasters or touches human. That whole push.
I think there's a lot to that. I mean, if you start from something's only a disaster if it impacts people, right? Then there are no natural disasters, right? Because the things that are impacted are built infrastructure, our social infrastructure, and now cyber stuff as well. Mm-hmm. But if we really look at it, if there's an earthquake in the middle of somewhere that there's nobody and there's going to be no tsunami and there's going to be nothing like that, then all right, that's fine. But when it does impact people, and that can include the economy too, right? I mean, COVID, huge, right? Even people that didn't get COVID, that were the lucky ones, and didn't get it, you're still impacted because of policies, restrictions, the economy, whatever it happens to be, right? So, yeah, I would say there's no natural disasters, but we need to be aware of the natural hazards that exist, right? So that we can actually plan a little bit better and start to work and say, how do we mitigate that? How do we adapt to that?
Yeah, we had a 7 point something earthquake a couple of years ago, 4th of July, actually. Which here obviously here in the United States is a big holiday. Up in China Lake, right? And China Lake is literally in the middle of nowhere. It's an old, well, I guess it's still a lake bed, but it's an old lake bed that there's a Navy base there, which is weird if you think about that. But anyway, it's in the middle of, it's a desert, and they do testing, bomb testing and stuff like that. That's exercises and stuff like this. I want to say maybe 5 or 8 homes were damaged, like severely damaged. That was about it. And so we never really talked about that earthquake, right? It's a very significant earthquake, a 7 point whatever. I felt it here in my house, and I'm probably a good 5 hours away from there. Kind of give you perspective on the distance. And again, so we go, oh yeah, there was this earthquake. It was kind of weird on 4th of July, nothing happened. But if that was in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, we'd still be recovering from that right now, right? So that's where it comes into this. And so there's a class I teach, we spoke about this before, called the social impacts of disaster. Are all, when we talk about the social impacts, it's not just, oh, how does it impact you, your home, which is terrible, right, if it's damaged, but it's also psychologically, politically, physically, just being able to get community back up and together. So if we take all those areas, how do we make robust communities then, built upon that stuff?
How much time do we have? Yeah, I think what it really comes down to is considering people first, always. And I think that's, for me, that's a guiding principle. People first, always. And it doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether it's building a new policy or, building a plan or taking the kid to the mountains to go hiking, like whatever it happens to be, right? We get consider the people impacts first, and actually talk to people. Imagine that, right? Like imagine we actually engaged in meaningful dialogue, and imagine we started off listening to understand the other person, right? To understand the other perspective rather than to be right. I mean, there's a stat that I'm going to get the numbers a little bit wrong, but it's the order of magnitude that matters. And it's, our brain takes, 400 milliseconds to process what we've just heard before we can start formulating a response. The typical time between two people engaging in a conversation is like 150 milliseconds. So before you even finish speaking, I've already started thinking about how I'm going to respond or the next point that I'm going to make. How do we actually understand other people if that's the baseline, right? So if we can work to find community leaders, right? Because it's not necessarily the elected official or like the highest paid person's opinion, the hippo, whatever it happens to be. If we can actually find those community leaders and engage in meaningful dialogue and say, what does your community look like? What makes it special? What makes it unique? Right? What do you love about it? And understand that and start to pull and understand that social fabric that exists in every small community. And you can do this on the micro scale. You can do this like neighborhood by neighborhood, right? There's communities that have these programs where it's like you've got a block captain or whatever they call it, but it's somebody who's volunteered to be like, hey, I'm going to know my neighbor, right? We're going to host a block party here. We're going to have a barbecue. 4th of July is a great time to do it, but we're going to have a barbecue here, and we're going to, everybody's going to get together, talk about who it is. If, new people moved into the neighborhood, blah, blah. And then you talk to the block 1 or 2 blocks over, and you have those block captains connect. and say, this is what's going on our street. This is what's going on our street, right? Let's bring those 3 blocks together now, or 4 blocks together, right? And then you can start building that out a little bit more. And I may not know all of my neighbors, but I'm going to know somebody who knows the person on the next street, right? And then, we hear a fire truck coming down the road. I'm going to know that, Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so needs some support, right? And know who they're also connected with, right? So it starts on that really micro level, and then listening and learning. Novel concept, right?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the problems that we have as government officials in emergency management is we want to tell people, right? We would like to tell people. We like to hear these programs, whether it's a CERT program, for instance, or whatever program, and we like to tell them what to do. And this is how we're going to make it better. And you will evacuate this way, and you will do this and do that. And we put signs up everywhere and tell people what to do. And you're right. I think when we do listening tours, if you will, that the listening portion of it is probably more critical than the tour part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it also comes down to understanding communities. Like the neighborhood that I live in, there's sort of a river on the south side, and then on the north and east side, it's a highway, right? And there's about 800 homes in this community, and it's split into 3 different communities. One of the communities, the median age in per household is like 67.
Wow.
And so instantly we're like, oh, vulnerable community, right? Like not only are they isolated because of the geography, but they're 67 years old. That's the median age. Like goodness knows we need to put a whole lot of resources there. And then pull one more thing and look and be like, well, if we've got all these seniors, how come there's no bus routes through there? And then you say like, what's the median? And this is not my part of the neighborhood, the other neighborhood, but the median income is like $287,000, something like that. I'm like, wait, all these people are retired and their median income is $287,000. We can divert resources somewhere else.
Right.
So we need to understand, again, that goes back to know the physical geography, know the built world, know the social world, and then be able to actually allocate resources more effectively.
That's one of the problems we have here in the United States. We've been looking at this closely. Is when we look at recovery, disaster recovery, those of us that are, in the middle class, we do okay, right? I mean, we might have to go through insurance or do whatever, but at some point, your house is built back to normal, right? And I mean, I have a friend of mine who lost part of his house due to a fire a few years ago. And outside of arguing with his insurance company to cover whether they're going to rip the drywall in or not, he's back in his home. Complete. They completely fixed it. The issue that we have is the poor do not know how to navigate, and I don't say this in a sense of education-wise or intelligence-wise, but they just don't have the resources, right? They don't have the insurance. They don't have that help. They don't have a person who they can call. They don't have a Jake by State Farm who they could pick the phone up and say, "Hey, Jake, help me out," right? They're still trying to figure out, what they're doing. And they get lost in the shuffle because now FEMA dollars are everybody thinks FEMA here in the United States, and it's like $4,000 per household. That's it. There's a check for $4,000. Good luck. Slap you on the back and send you on your way. And it's not quite that crass, but it feels that way. Yeah. So that's the social side of impact. That's social impacts of disaster is that, right? Because you have those that have resources and needs and that can meet their needs. And when we talked about evacuation yesterday, how do you get people out that have mobility needs? What I mean by mobility needs aren't just the people who can't walk in wheelchairs. It's those that do not have cars, right? How do you expect them to evacuate? So we need to take those into consideration. That's all about community, right? It goes back to what you're saying with knowing your neighborhood and then having those connections built. And Daniel Ulrich from Northwestern University in his book Black Wave talks about connections, loose connections, hard connections. Do you see that? And I know some of the problems we have here in the States, and I talked to some people over in Europe as well, England, and they feel the same way. But do you see like there's a less of connection between neighborhoods today than say 30 years ago?
It's funny. I think like we've got so in most areas in the city I live in, we got back alleys and people have garages in the back, right? Or even if you got a garage in the front of the house, like you drive into the garage and then you go into the house from there, right? So the only time you see your neighbors is when you're actually mowing the lawn, right? Like if you've got a lawn, and then it's so loud that you can't hear anybody anyway, right?
Right.
So just the way that we've designed our communities to make them more car friendly, because like having a car is important, right? But the way we've designed our communities means that we're going to be a little bit more isolated, right? Unless you're deliberate about it, right? And that goes back to like chat with a couple of neighbors, right? I mean, this is going to be foreign to a lot of the listeners right now, but there's this hockey thing going on, right? And like go Rangers. We'll get there. That's for you.
Thank you.
But I promised not to make you laugh too much, so I had to get that one in. But a bunch of our people in our neighborhood, we would just sit around, get a projector, put the game up on somebody's garage door, or a big outdoor screen, and then everybody sit around and enjoy the games, right? I mean, you can do that for any sport, but you can do that also for any other event, right? There's lots of opportunities to just build community.
Yeah, absolutely. I live in a cul-de-sac, kind of, sharing that story is that, and in the summertime we do a movie on our front because we're at the end of the cul-de-sac, and so we do a movie night in the summertime, and we project the movie out there, and everybody kind of gets their lawn chairs out and stuff like this, and watches the movie at the end of the cul-de-sac. It's a lot of fun. We have about 5-6 houses that engage in that event. And it's doing stuff like that. You're absolutely right. And I'll tell you, talking about those connections that when COVID did hit, and we'll get into supply chain questions here in a second, because I think this is a good segue actually. So everybody was panic buying everything. Like you couldn't find here in the States, you couldn't find anything. I don't know if it's the same way up in Canada or not. But my neighbor, their kids only drink goat's milk. And so every time we went out to the store, we would look for goat's milk and just pick up a bottle, because it's always good, that she could put it through her rotation. And then we had a couple of elderly neighbors, and we would say, "Hey, what do you need?" And we would buy them groceries, and so they wouldn't have to go out and expose themselves to COVID. And I think that all stemmed from doing that little silly, watching a Disney movie on the garage door, on a summer evening, in California, and but it also helped with that everybody knew what we were looking for, and when we had the supply chain issues, still do, everybody was able to find stuff that they needed. How do you see the supply chain issues impacting communities? Do you see people gonna start hoarding stuff, or are they gonna share?
Yeah, I can't really necessarily speak to the individual level, right? Like we're sharing. Clearly, you're sharing, but there are some people who are quite concerned about what's going on, and so one of the really interesting things is there's this push from some areas for buy local, and it was always buy local, support the local farmers, support the small people, and this was even well before COVID.
Mhm.
That sort of like 100-mile meal, right?
Right.
So all your food comes from within 100 miles, and anybody who was good at that and practicing that just thrived during the pandemic. Right? They weren't impacted by, they were, but they weren't impacted as severely by all the different disruptions that happened. Right? Like, heaven forbid, in northern Canada, I can't, get a fresh mango. That's just not going to happen. But finding ways to do a lot of new things, and one of the things that I've loved seeing over the last 2 years is the number of community gardens that have popped up.
Yeah.
And we actually had a few different communities that I know of where they're like, "What are we going to do? Like, community garden? Okay." The community pitched in and bought greenhouse stuff, and so they were actually able to keep going during the winter. And and we do get a solid week or more, depending, of -40, and it doesn't matter whether it's Fahrenheit or Celsius; it's still really cold. Um, but the sorry, that's twice now. But having the ability to actually continue that growing season and carry on, again, that's community coming back together, right? So that you can still have the fresh veggies and those kinds of things that you need. So I think the other thing, and Matthew McConaughey said it a couple of days ago when speaking from the White House, and it doesn't matter what the issue is, but the key part is we agree about more of this than we disagree, right? And so deliberately finding common ground, starting from that, rather than saying like, I'm this, you're that, whatever it happens to be, right? Like I'm green, you're orange, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Let's find out what we agree on, right? Because that's going to close the gap a whole lot, right? And so if it's, our neighbor down the street has got mobility challenges, or they need goat milk, right?
Right.
Okay, great. I'm going to the store. I can support, right? Because it doesn't matter at that point, it doesn't matter what your political views are. It doesn't matter what, like what your religion is. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're building that community with your neighbors.
Yeah, I want to say Ronald Reagan said something along the lines, if you agree with me 80%, we can work on the 20. I'm paraphrasing the quote, but and I think that's correct, right? I mean, like, we're never going to agree 100% on anything, I mean, it's heck, you might be all on the same side. All of a sudden, you start talking about sports teams, and you're on the other side of the uniform, and everybody's like, it's like, I don't like you anymore because you like that team, but yeah, I mean, if we can find that 80% in everything that we do, I think that's critical. And going back to your concept, or what you're talking about regarding knowing your neighbor, one of my volunteers when I was working in city government came up with this idea, and we expanded upon it and implemented it. Was the idea of we called it Neighbor for Neighbor, and we went and did basically. I was told I had to do some of the stuff regarding neighborhood watch, and I'm like, okay, neighborhood watch programs are great when there's something going on, like if there's a crime wave happening, everybody wants to get together. But as soon as the crime wave is over, it's like literally, I went to a neighborhood watch meeting where I was the host, myself, and a plate of cookies, and there's a reason why I'm chubby, is because I went to a lot of these meetings where I'm the only one having to eat all this damn cookies, right? And so I blame the police department for that. So just let you know, I couldn't say no, right? So but the idea of neighbor for neighbor really put it on another stand, because we could do neighborhood watch stuff, right, when there's no crime happening, or to prevent crime. And then the other side of it is we could do disaster preparedness, and everybody's disaster or crisis is individual. And in the case of this, there was a little old lady who lived in the neighborhood, and she didn't have a vehicle, and the people in the neighborhood didn't realize that she had this issue, and they got together and they created a schedule to get her to the doctor, to get her to beauty salon appointments, to get her to the grocery store, and like the whole neighborhood adopted her, and she was kind of a shut-in until we had that program. So I mean, if we say one person is successful, I would say one neighborhood. That was one neighborhood that came together around disaster preparedness and really started helping one person who had mobility issues. And I think that's what community is all about.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that this huge sort of triggered with me is the idea of language, right? Like we have neighborhood watch, and like, what's the sign for neighborhood watch? It's like cut out of a house with like these eyes like staring from behind a curtain, right? So what does that tell you? It's like, be suspicious of everyone, right? Like, stay in your home, it's not safe. Like that's not the whole point of it, right? The whole point was to build community. And because it started in the Cold War and all that kind of stuff, it was like, watch out for the Reds,
right?
This is dangerous. And so, how do we, neighbor for neighbor sounds like a great way to frame it, right? And however you're going to frame it, make sure that it's enabling language, so that we're not, inadvertently working against what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I tell my friend all the time, words matter, and he holds me to it sometimes because sometimes I'll say something and he'll call me out on it, and I have to like justify why I use those particular words. But it's true though, right? You know, like I think when you're just like casual conversation, it's a little bit different. You don't have to purse your words, but when you're actually doing something when it's public facing that you're discussing, that you really should be thinking about what that message is, and that's going down to messaging. You know, when we talk about disaster preparedness and building robust communities, um, as my students and I had a conversation the other day about this, is it all politics? And when I say politics, right? It's political, I should say. It's not that it's red versus blue or green versus orange or whatever, right? It's the person who's in charge of the community, whether it's the mayor or whatever. Um, you know, when a disaster occurs, there people are looking to them for answers, and if there's no answers, they're gonna lose their job. So if you're working for city government, you know you have to be considering that aspect of the political question that happens, and you have to think that way. You can't deny it. But I asked the question one time to a couple of the FEMA administrators, former FEMA administrators, at a conference, and we're doing a round table. And I asked them, how do we take politics out of emergency management? And Craig Fugate goes, you can't. Emergency management is politics. Is it the same way in Canada?
I think it is. I mean, we've got a really different system. We don't have a FEMA,
Right.
so we don't. I mean, we've got our Public Safety Canada, and they sort of work on policy coordination primarily, and then they sort of hold the strings to like open up the surprise bag of all the federal government resources that could possibly come, which is quite often the military that gets to come to support. But in many ways, we don't have that robust capability, and our the way that our Constitution is written quite different from the American Constitution, for a whole lot of different reasons. But the way that it's actually set up, our provinces have jurisdiction over disasters, and the feds can say like, "Hey, you should do this," and the provinces are like, "Thanks." And but there's no overarching mechanism unless we invoke the Emergencies Act,
Right.
which is like it's been done once, and it was because of protests recently that were threatening to cripple an entire city. I mean, it was a non-violent version of your January event a couple of years ago.
Right.
Canadian protests, gotta love them. They brought a sauna with them to a coup. So let's figure that out, right? Good. But
right?
without being too flippant about it, our structure is different, right? And that means that there has to be politics. Right? You have to be able to negotiate. You have to be able to engage and have discussions at multiple different levels. Right? And then the other one that is incredibly important to me and to many other people, especially when you start talking about people in community, our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities have a direct relationship with the federal government, with the Crown, right? And so that can add some complexity when a disaster happens, because if it impacts a nation, then who are they supposed to be coordinating with, right? There's this weird jurisdictional coordination piece that needs to happen, and so we need to be really mindful of that and ensure that, again, we're being inclusive in terms of how we're actually having those conversations and how we're building those policies and how we're making sure that everybody's got a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And at multiple tables.
Right. I mean, it's very similar. I mean, like at the end of the day, we say disasters are run locally, right? Supported by the state, and then and then basically funded by the federal government, if you like, for lack of a better term. But for the First Nation issue, I think is kind of interesting because, especially like up in New York, Vermont, and Maine, and that area, New Hampshire, there's a few of the tribes that cross border, right? There's which is, I don't know if you've ever crossed the border over there, which is a whole different trippy thing because you're not. Yeah. And for those, I'm trying to explain something that's like unexplainable realistically because you're kind of in the United States and you're not in the United States, and you're kind of in Canada, but you're not in Canada. And there's like different rules for crossing the border up there. And there's dirt roads that literally will go between our countries that aren't guarded in any way, because technically they're not necessarily in each one of our each country. So yeah. And so there's a lot of issues up there when it comes to disaster response and sending monies, and it gets complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah. But that's what we're paid for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, if things were easy to solve, then we'd all be out of jobs.
Absolutely. Josh, we're coming close to the end here. Well, actually, I guess we are at the end. Looking at my time, I always can run over in these conversations because they can go for a long time. But tell me really quick about what you're doing up at your school, and then how people can find you.
Yeah. So I'm at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. We've got a professional development and research and training center, our Center for Applied Disaster and Emergency Management, and then we've also got a disaster and emergency management diploma program, which is entirely online right now and asynchronous. So we've got students across the country and from around the world. I'm biased. I think it's a fantastic program. I think all of the things that we do are just awesome. But we've got about 100 students that we take in every year on the diploma side, and I think we've got like a 97% placement rate for our students when they come out. So like clearly we're doing something right.
Right.
But I'm on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and love to connect more.
Absolutely, Josh. It was such a pleasure talking to you today, and we should do this again soon.
I would love to, Todd. Thanks so much.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for putting up with my cold. And as always, if you guys are driving down the road, don't have a pencil, or your pencil's not sharp, don't fret. We have Josh's information in the show notes as well, so you can go ahead and click it over there. And, well, everybody, until next week, please stay safe and stay hydrated.